thank you everybody for turning out tonight. It's not the best of evenings, but I think you'll realise it's well worth coming. It's going to be a very good meeting, I think. This meeting's been organised by the WREN Conservation and Wildlife Group, and I would put in a little plug. If anybody's not a member, then you can join up here tonight. We're lucky enough to have Tricia Moxey speaking this evening.
And Paul.
She's got a fantastic wealth of experience of everything to do with nature in Epping Forest and this area. Not least the flora of the area. Tricia's going to speak and show wonderful pictures for about 45 minutes. Then we'll have a short interval when people can get their mince pies. I'm not sure whether there's going to be enough to go around actually, but orderly queues will be expected. And the raffle will be drawn at the interval as well. And then after that, Paul Ferris, another fantastic local naturalist, will give an introduction with a little bit more of a very local bias, and I think maybe put out some ideas for the sort of things that we can all get involved with next spring and next summer. So without any further ado, I'll let Tricia get on with it.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks, Tim, and it's a great pleasure to see so many people here this evening. When Tim and Paul and I met together to discuss what we would like to do, I thought probably something that will actually sort of encompass the southern end of the forest. I mean, obviously the whole of Epping Forest is a very big area, but in fact I really want to concentrate on the area that's south of Woodford, because we found in sort of looking at how people appreciate the forest that most people actually really do appreciate their own local patch. And I'm assuming, with one or two exceptions, most of you are sort of fairly local to this area. And as so, you probably might recognise the picture that's on the screen at the moment. Can we have the lights down, Jill, please? Any thoughts as to where? It's Wanstead Park, it's the glade, it's from the top end of the glade. And of course Wanstead Park is one of the very special areas locally, and I will be saying quite a bit about Wanstead Park because that has an influence on what goes on all around the area. But thanks to Google Earth, we're able to actually get a bird's eye view of what is in our immediate area. Wanstead Park is this area here. Wanstead Flats, that sort of area there, is Bushwood. And then you've got Leighton Flats running up towards Gilbert Slade there. And that was the area that we really wanted to cover because that's the area that Paul has done a lot of work in to record the various plants, and he's going to say more about that later on. But obviously there is the opportunity to look at sort of the natural landscape as it remains down the River Roding here as well. And today we are very much sort of aware of the fact that it's very important to join up bits of green space one with another. These are called green corridors. And there's a lot of emphasis now on thinking, well, how do all the people who live in these houses, here, actually sort of make have access to the greenness around them, because that's very important. Today they recognise that an awful lot of us live within an urban situation, and we're in grave danger of suffering from a particular kind of deficit called nature deficit. We don't have enough opportunity to actually sort of get out there and appreciate the wildness sort of on our doorsteps or a little bit further away. And an awful lot of people just sort of live within a sort of very close sort of concrete controlled environment and don't have any interaction with the natural world. And this is very much to their detriment. We all feel a lot better when we get outside and can enjoy being outside on a day like today. Or even, when it was pouring with rain earlier in the week, you can sort of still benefit from from that. But we are lucky that we have a fantastic range of different kind of habitats locally that still survive, that give us this opportunity to get out there into open spaces. This is Gilbert Slade, just north of Snaresbrook Road. That's Leighton Flats. You know, could be any woodland, sort of anywhere. Wanstead Flats, River Roding, Heronry Pond, full of water. Allotments on Empress Avenue. Those are all some of the different kinds of habitats where there's going to be an opportunity for all kinds of plants and animals to thrive. I haven't got pictures of back gardens because obviously you've all got your own access to you know, if not your own garden, then somebody else's garden nearby. And there are many, many gardens, and they are particularly valuable for wildlife observations for the simple reason that they lay on your doorstep. And I think they've been overlooked as being really important wildlife areas. And it's really going to be quite interesting to challenge people to try and find out how many weeds, i.e. flowers that are in the wrong place, are actually growing in your gardens. The average number of different kinds of things that grow on people's lawns is 27. Now, I'm not going to suggest you actually go out there, you know, tomorrow and have a look, but certainly, you know, when you get the opportunity, you know, you don't necessarily need to know what they all are, but you can say, well, that one's different from that one. And, you know, the challenge is actually to try and put a name to them. See if you can come up with more than 27. But the whole sort of area round about here has in fact got a particular kind of geology which is going to influence the kind of things that are grown here. And it's the geology, the topography, the climate, and its land use history which have influenced what kind of vegetation we're likely to find today. And the main underlying geological feature here are river terrace gravels. And that's a picture of them. They really are very stony soils. They're free draining soils. Those of you who garden here will know that you know it's very difficult to actually sort of get sort of luscious things to survive unless you give them an awful lot of manure and water and so on. They're free draining soils. It would be very difficult to sort of have things that, you know, are greedy plants sort of growing here. But the kind of natural vegetation that you would expect to hear are wiry grasses and gorse and heather and broom and birch trees. And we have those still around if you go out and look for them. There's some gorse, wiry grasses, so on Leighton Flats. The other constraint, if you like, on what will grow here is the rainfall. And our rainfall here is about 24, 25 inches a year. Obviously it's going to vary, and we know now that things are not quite as stable as they were, and we are being told to expect, you know, either summer droughts or heavy downpours, or something's going to happen. Nobody's quite sure how to predict, you know, what climate change is going to bring about. But basically, the dark blue there is the high ground on the Forest Ridge round about sort of High Beach and Loughton, where the high ground there attracts a great deal more rain. And, you know, over here on the coast of Essex, there's very little rainfall. It's drier over much of the county than it is in the eastern Mediterranean. And this, you know, has its own problems. But you know, the kind of plants that grow here are ones that are well adapted to coping with dry conditions. The land surface is not that higher above sea level, about 26 metres, something like that, and sort of sloping down towards the River Roding in the east, and sloping gently down towards the Thames, generally over the whole area. And because it was sort of raised up between the valley of the River Roding on the east and the valley of the river Lee on the west, this would have been quite a useful sort of plateau area for early peoples to have started to settle in the area. And we know that we've got evidence now of people using the area from the early Iron Age, probably even before then. We've been able to do excavation work and find evidence, bits of pottery, coins and so on, indicating that people have actually been settling in the area for a long time. This is a lovely Victorian illustration of some flint snappers. These were the bits of flint that were worked from all those pebbles that you see in the ground. Total disregard for health and safety. Because I think if anybody's sort of tried doing flint knapping, you know jolly well that it sends off lots of little shards of flint, and I'm pretty sure they would have actually had some kind of animal skin apron just to protect their vital bits from being scattered with sharp pointy bits of flint. But we know that there were settled people around from 4,000 or so years ago in the area, making use of the natural vegetation that would have grown here, which included hazelnuts. Because hazel was one of the early plants to sort of be around in the area, and we know that the early people certainly did sort of gather hazelnuts, other berries as well, and they made use of the animals that were around in the area as a source of food. The red deer, which was an animal that remained as a very favoured animal to hunt for a very long time. The other plants that were around before the Romans were here, the small leaf lime tree, which has very palatable leaves that their animals may well have wanted to eat. But it also has very useful bark and useful woods that can be made into a number of different objects, so that it was quite a useful plant to have, alongside oak and birch as well. So these trees would have probably grown reasonably well on the soils at the time, because the climate was slightly different from how it is today. But once the Romans had come and gone, and I'm not going to dwell too much on what they sort of left behind, because obviously they did have a big influence on the area, we move forward to the time when the land was actually sort of carved up into different manorial areas. The green areas are the bits that remained wooded for a very long time. That's Wanstead there, there's Leighton. But basically you've got the River Roding here and the River Lee there, and a ridge of highland between the two river valleys. And the way our Anglo-Saxon ancestors divided up the area was to give each manor a piece of land which had access to the river and access on the whole to some wooded area. And between the two, there was an opportunity to have farmland. The trees, which perhaps had come further down towards the rivers, had been cleared back in perhaps Iron Age times. And this high ridge of land here is best left to grow trees. And people in the past needed access to grazing marshes along the river valleys, farmland to grow crops, and woodland here to provide fuel, timber, and the animals of the chase, the deer and wild boar, which would have been around then. And these boundaries still survive today. We actually, there've been one or two slight tinkerings with the arrangement, but on the whole, those Anglo-Saxon boundaries are still there today, and you can find evidence of them in other area, bits further north in the forest where perhaps the land hasn't been messed about quite so much, as wood banks separating one parish from another. The Normans were very enthusiastic hunters, and they set up capital in London, and were obviously well able to come out into Essex to enjoy the hunt. We have very little evidence of what kind of establishment they might have actually used as their base when they were hunting in the sort of forest area. But we do know a little bit more about the hunting lodge that was at Writtle, which is probably contemporary with one that was here on the edge of Leighton Flats. And you know, quite a big building, various enclosures and so on. So there was some kind of establishment at the southern end of the forest where the king and his courtiers could actually come and enjoy a hunt in the forest area. And we know that you know, various monarchs came out to the area to chase the deer and the wild boar across the sort of open land that would have been here, and you know, enjoyed a day's hunting. By the time Henry VIII arrived on the scene, he wanted to actually enclose an area, and he chose to enclose Wanstead in about 1512. But before Henry sort of established the hunting park, we know from the records that there were a large number of animals that were having an influence on the vegetation. Fallow deer had been introduced by the Normans, and they are excellent at converting poor quality grassland and so on to nice tasty meat, into venison. The records from the Abbey and from, you know, various other sources indicate there were a large number of sheep on Wanstead Flats, Leighton Flats, and down on the marshes along the edge of the River Lee and on the Thames. Sheep were very important. Sheep nibble away at vegetation and create a very nice smooth sward. If there are too many of them, you don't get new shoots of trees coming up. They just sort of keep it nice and short. The rabbits have been introduced by the Normans, and they too like eating lots of grass. But until sort of about the end of the 18th century, no, middle of the 19th century, I think probably, rabbits were actually controlled within specially enclosed areas called rabbit warrens. And that name lingers on locally. We've got several warren roads locally, and I don't know if there's anybody called warrener here, but if you were a warrener, your job was to actually look after the rabbits and make sure that they weren't poached, because obviously rabbits were rather tasty, and they served a dual function in the medieval times. The rabbits provided nice tasty meat and fur, and black rabbits would occur naturally within the population, and the black rabbit fur went to the bishops. They had black lining to their cloaks, apparently. So we got 3 animals there, and then of course the local people had cattle, and they could actually let their animals wander in the sort of open areas to graze and produce milk and calves and you know, new animals as well. And they too would have had an influence on the vegetation, and we'll come back to that a bit later on. This is a map of 1628, which shows Wanstead as an enclosed area there. There's the Roding coming down there, and the Aldersbrook, I think it's probably that one there. And at that time, River Roding certainly was tidal up to about there. There's the Thames down there. When the forest was a royal hunting forest, which it had become under the Normans, the area was actually split up into a number of different walks, which were under the control of an official keeper of the forest. And we've got access to quite a lot of records about that. But the main one to notice is, there's Wanstead Park, West Hainault there, and Leighton Walk there, Woodford Walk there. These walks would be patrolled by the keeper, and he would keep a note of anything that was sort of happening that wasn't quite right. And they had the responsibility of making sure the deer were well looked after, but also that the trees that provided the animals with shelter and food were also protected. And they had to make returns to various people, and from those we know that there were a certain amount of wooded area shown on this map here. That's the Eagle Pond, just to help you locate where you are. And there's Leighton Flats, and there's the farmland, nice regular fields all around there, which gives you an indication of what the area was like. This one includes Wanstead itself, and there it's called the Lower Forest. Wanstead Flats has changed its name more than once. And date of this map is 1777, and you're beginning to see quite large estates developing around the park itself. But by the time we get to the end of the 17th century, there were significant changes occurring to the lifestyle of people who were living in the area. And one very influential person was Sir Josiah Child, who had the opportunity of buying up the estate at Wanstead. And he was able, because he was a very wealthy man, to actually make a significant contribution to what is left of the original sort of mixture of woodland, farmland and grazing heathland areas. As soon as he had established himself at Wanstead, he did what a lot of late 17th century people do, want to expand his control over the land that wasn't necessarily his to own, but he wanted to put his mark on the area, and he applied to the Crown to actually enclose and fell the trees in a number of areas. And we have records of 120 acres of land in and around sort of Wanstead area, which had sort of woodland on it with pollarded trees like these hornbeam trees, which he said he was going to fell and replace with other trees. And that's what he did. So where you had, traditional wooded areas, he set about systematically clearing those areas and putting his mark on the landscape. That's the pond on the golf course, Overton Drive. That's about where you've got the gates on Bushwood Road. And then you've got these radiating avenues out. There's St Paul's Cathedral. So a barren land, and sort of contemporary records to say, sort of cleared of trees, but replanted with trees. That particular one there is called Evelyn Avenue. And there are still some of those trees that survive today. This one is 8 metres round. That one is 5 metres round. It's a bit harder to measure that one. But if you measure the girth of a significant tree, you can get an approximate age for it. For the first 100 years of a tree's life, if it's growing well, it increases in girth by about an inch a year. After that, it's a sort of sliding scale, because mathematically it's a lot harder for trees to sort of grow at that kind of rate. But by comparing the girth of trees here with the girth of trees in Greenwich Park, when we know when they were planted, and other ones across the country, we know that these trees are the ones. If we go back. Let's go back. Oh, No, we'll forget about that, right. But anyway, they were part of these avenues of trees. These are the three that survive opposite the station, George Green. And that one's missing quite a bit because it got struck by lightning. That one, you know, again, is missing quite a bit. But this one has a girth which would suggest that it's one of the ones that was planted round about the end of the 1690, something like that. You know, 1690, 1700 and so on. So, you know, they really are very special trees. You know, they've been there a long time, and they remind us of this mania that the landowners had at that time to actually put their stamp on the landscape and plant these incredible avenues of trees. But when you think about it, how difficult it must have been to actually get these trees to become established in free draining soil with actually, you know, a lot of aftercare. Too many trees today, when they're planted, they don't get the right kind of aftercare to make sure that they're going to survive. But we know from the evidence that a lot of those avenue trees did survive. Maybe they had to go back and plant them again if they failed. But of course, people like Sir Josiah Child, money was no object, and you just clicked your fingers and people did things. You know, they had lots and lots of helpers. I wouldn't say they were paid helpers, because Sir Josiah Child certainly was very much involved in the slave trade. He may well have had several slaves working for him on the estate here. This is an area of research that, you know, needs further investigation. Whoever it was, they had grandiose ideas for encapsulating a fantastic garden. This is looking the other way, looking down the glade from the house, the Tudor house, which is there. These gardens were laid out to rival Versailles. Wanstead was a place that people came to because it was such a fantastic area. Lots and lots of intricate gardening work that went on, fantastic sort of clipped hedges and pools and so on. Within that landscape, that's the canal on the ornamental water, and these two little pimples here are in fact the mounts that are on either side of the glade. So we know they were there then. They probably were there in an earlier garden, but we don't know too much about them as yet. When Sir Josiah Child died, one of his sons inherited for a short while, but he died. But Sir Richard Child was the successor, who took over running the estate in 1704. And he and his wife had 8 children, and the important one is Emma, because Emma married Sir Robert Tilney Long, and it was her granddaughter Catherine who inherited Wanstead in 1805, and that has a bearing on what happened later. But Sir Richard Child was unhappy with the Tudor house that was in the area, and so he commissioned Colin Campbell to produce this fantastic house which replaced the Tudor one. It rivalled the size of Buckingham Palace. Faced with white Portland stone, it was visible from the other side of the Thames, and it was a very grand house, finished in about 1722 or thereabouts. And obviously a grand house like that needed to have the grounds to set it off. But the inside was actually really quite special as well. That is Sir Josiah Child, and there's his wife. And in the original picture, she's showing him an ace of hearts. They were supposedly very happily married for a long time. He was a fairly wealthy man. He had not really inherited a great deal of money from his father and the East India Company, but his income came from landed estates, and he became very interested in acquiring land over quite a large portion of Essex. But he was quite a learned gentleman, and he developed a very close friendship with Bishop Compton, who was Bishop of London and was very much involved in sending people off to America to go and find new plants to bring back to this country. And when Bishop Compton died, Sir Richard Child got a good number of those plants. Many of them were actually rather tender things and had to live inside in a greenhouse. But there were a number of trees that actually sort of got planted out in the gardens at Wanstead, one of which was an acacia tree. And we have got acacias in the district. Now, whether they're descendants or not of Bishop Compton's trees, we don't know. But it's nice to think that, you know, there is a little bit of America sort of over here. The other person who was very much involved with Wanstead was William Kemp. And I've got a picture of him in a minute, but Sir Richard Child became a Whig in 1717. Now, until then, garden design had been all this sort of very fancied Versailles type things, you know, lots of clipped hedges and, you know, parterres and things like that. And so he really wanted to make things sort of less complicated. And so maybe with the help of somebody like William Kent, although we've got no evidence yet to suggest that he actually was much involved with gardens, because he didn't start becoming a garden designer of some repute until 1725. The whole formality was swept aside and things became very much more sort of naturalistic, and that was a sign of a Whig garden. There is politics in gardening. And this is the Roke map, which is showing sort of some of the improvements to the area, particularly the development of the lakes. And, you know, the lakes which we still enjoy today within the area cover 43, an enormous amount of water. And you think how much hard work went into actually digging out those areas. And of course this meant resculpturing the landscape. And you know jolly well, as soon as you actually sort of make bare ground, weeds move in. But obviously they had armies of people who could actually deal with the weeds and sort of, you know, tame it so that they got what they wanted, so that it looked all right. But many of the weedy species that you associate with grassland areas, I think, would have been incorporated into that kind of landscape. We tend to think that, you know, the beautiful parklands areas were just grass. In fact, there seems to be a lot of evidence now that they encouraged the wild meadow flowers in that grass area because it left little speckles of colour all the way through the grassland. So it wasn't just plain green. It had lots of lovely subtle colours all through it as well. So it would have been, you know, quite delightful to look at it. And of course, we can, you know, really enjoy those water areas today. And those water areas are going to have their own particular marginal plants around them. But they were formalised, these water areas. And this is, to some extent, not quite a true picture, because Wanstead House is there, but it's shown with, you know, the extensions that were never built. But these lovely lollipop trees all the way around the basin there. These, we think, were white poplars, and we've still got white poplars in the park today. Descendants, no doubt, of those trees. As time went by, the whole concept of landscaping parks became very much less formal, much more naturalistic, and so things were sort of allowed to sort of change from very sort of orderly fashion into, you know, sweeps of trees and grasslands and so on. And this map of the end of the 18th century, you know, shows the basin, the ponds there, but no indication of anything sort of very formal in the way of gardens in there. In 1805, Catherine, granddaughter of Sir Richard child, inherited the estate, and she made an unfortunate alliance with who we refer to as Wicked William, over here, who saw, lots of money, I'm going to squander it all, and but in the meantime, I'm going to spend and spend and spend. And one of the people that he invited to do some work on the area was Humphrey Repton, but there's no evidence that Humphrey Repton ever got paid for what he did. But Repton drew up plans to enhance the area, and this is where the golf club is. There's the basin, and there's the parterre, and that was Repton's design, and that actually happened because you can actually see the layout of that on the ground. But he also encouraged a much more sort of naturalistic appearance to the wooded areas that were developing within the park itself. And you probably recognise this lovely sort of bluebell wood. We've got fantastic patches of bluebells there. Now, those bluebells may well have been part of the original sort of design, having speckles in the grass, but certainly there's an opportunity to enjoy the bluebells there now. Repton encouraged the planting of rather nice individual specimen trees, and that's the cedar that overhangs the ornamental water. A little bit precarious, but it's still there. And this is a map from about 1850. You see there's a sort of Union Jack pattern there on the plain. That's where the house was. That's where the golf course is now. There's the basin. Repton used a technique known as bundle planting, where you stick several trunks of a young tree, same species, in the hole together and hope over time that they will actually join together. This is the one in Reservoir Wood, which is a fine example of a bundle tree. And you can actually see the joins, where the tree trunks haven't actually joined up particularly well. And that's another one. And there are a number of them in that sort of crisscross pattern across the plain. So, go and have a look at them. And you sort of think, they don't look quite right because their branches don't grow, as they would do normally. And if you look very carefully, you can actually see the joins. So go and have a look. Look for those. And remember that Repton never got paid for doing the work. Well, William and Catherine were not particularly happy. It's a story that many of you may well be familiar with. But it resulted in the loss of the house, but not the land surrounding the house. But in order to meet the creditors, a lot of the very fine trees which had developed over time were cut down, not just in sort of the Wanstead Park area, but right out into sort of bushwood and so on. A lot of really fine trees were cut down. I think the ones that survive are the ones that actually, didn't meet the sort of requirements of the timber merchants. So we're lucky that we've still got those trees today. Obviously, the arrival of the railway meant that there was prime land to be developed all around the area, and a significant amount of that land which got converted into housing came from the sort of local farmland. But some did come from the forest area itself. So, the forest did shrink down there. But it ultimately led to the protection of Epping Forest with the passing of the Epping Forest Act. And that was a very important thing because it meant that the forest was actually saved. But that, quote sort of, describes what was happening at that time. Places were getting a bit sort of neglected and so on. And it also tells you that the park area where it didn't have trees on it was being let out for grazing, sheep and cattle. There are all sorts of lovely pictures that have survived from the development of photography, but I've chosen to use one of Basil Holmes' illustrations, which he produced round about 1880, I think it was. So the ornamental water, not quite snap, but he captured the essence of what the park was like. And we can still appreciate that today, because Wanstead Park came into public use as an approved park when the corporation took it on and opened it up in 1882, I think it was. So we can enjoy, Wanstead Park as a public place. But the then superintendent of the forest felt that he wanted to put his mark not just on Wanstead Park, but on the immediate area round about. And Alexander Mackenzie had been a noted landscape designer of the 19th century. He'd been responsible for a number of big works in London, particularly the Embankment Gardens, where plane trees are his signature tree. And so he decided that he would mark all the roads around Wanstead Flats, Leighton Flats, and wherever else he could, with plane trees. And so if you wander around Centre Drive or any of the roads around here, you will notice that there are a significant number of plane trees all the way around the edges of the forest. And they're there thanks to Alexander Mackenzie. A tremendous amount of effort, again, to actually get trees to grow in very inhospitable ground. Because he obviously managed to get his workforce to actually do the aftercare to make sure that those trees survive. So that's just some of the plane trees. I wasn't going to photograph all of them, but there are an awful lot of them. Alexander Mackenzie died in about 1890, but he'd carefully arranged that his successor should be his son, because he took him on as an apprentice, and he was the best candidate when they did have the open interviews afterwards, after he died. But anyway, Francis Mackenzie took on the mantle that his father had, and he was very keen to embellish various parts of the forest to make it much more interesting for the many people who came to use the area. And this is the hollow ponds, which were old sort of gravel pits dug out to create a most beautiful feature on Leighton Flats. And I've chosen a really sort of nice picture there. And of course, you can appreciate how they've become nicely wooded on their banks over time. When we get to the 20th century, the vegetation is subjected to a number of different changes. Increasing number of houses, decline in the amount of farmland and all the plants that you would find on the farmland. But of course, most majority of those houses will have had significant gardens. And it's quite likely that hidden in corners and on lawns and so on, there are remnants of those plants that you would have found in grasslands, in pastures, in those fields. And that's the challenge, see what still survives. We got street lights and curbs on the edge. For a long time, the Conservatives resisted having street lights on the forest roads, and they resisted actually putting curbs in as well, but highways insisted. And so, now you've down in this part of the forest, you've actually got that sort of, edged, hard edge to the roads. As time went by, increased the number of motor cars. In the 1970s, Dutch elm disease ravaged, large areas of the wooded areas, and that meant that, the dead and dying trees had to be cut down, and others replaced them. So we've got a slightly different vegetation as a result. Major road schemes, we've had upheaval in creating those. The storm of '87 highlighted the importance of trees in the district. I've heard tales of the trees just along the road from here actually being corkscrewed out of the ground with the wind on that particular night. And, that kind of thing meant that we lost a number of big trees. But it did mean that there was an opportunity to get funding to actually do a proper survey of Wanstead Park, which has resulted in various things happening. In more recent time, the loss of cattle from the southern end of the forest has had its impact on the vegetation. And then ultimately, in the 1990s, we have had the production of a forest-wide management plan, which is now sort of thinking about how do we actually manage various habitats that we have. That's a bit of elm with Dutch elm disease on the trunk, sort of very lumpy bark there, and it's got a little mite on the leaves there. That's looking up the glade, and the vegetation on either side was very much influenced by the loss of the elms, which were a significant feature of these areas here, and a lot of new trees were planted in the 1970s. Road improvements sometimes meant that you got extra interesting plants included in the road scheme. And this is a whole clump of vegetation, mainly ladies' bedstraw, on the ground at Greenman Roundabout. Because the traffic scheme there included specific recommendations to plant the right kind of plants that you would expect to find in that area. So people were beginning to think about how do we make the area much more interesting for biodiversity? How can we retain some of the interesting plants in an area? Survey work in Wanstead Park revealed a lot more about its history. We need to know an awful lot more about its natural history, and Paul will be saying various things a little bit later on. And our challenge is to get you to help do some recording. There's still planting going on. This is the avenue of sweet chestnuts in front of the temple. The conservators on the whole do not like planting trees because they say it's much better to let the sort of natural world sort of take over. But they will make exceptions to it, and this was one of the exceptions. But their emphasis now is actually how to manage these open spaces to make sure that the biological interest of those areas is actually maintained. So they're looking very carefully about how do you actually sort of look after these sort of acid grasslands, which in the past have been grazed. And it's grazing that keeps their floristic interest. It's not at the moment practical to have lovely big cows back down here in the south, because there are too many roads. But there are other animals. Rabbits would do the job quite well. The problem is that rabbits and a lot of human walking about, especially with dogs, don't go hand in hand. The alternative is to mow, but mowing takes the top off everything, and it's not quite the same as looking after an area with grazing animals. But they're also looking after the woodlands, because we've got some really fantastic old trees there, and they're making sure that these old trees have the opportunity to survive. So there's a certain amount of clearance work carried out around some of the trees, and in some instances they do some very careful pruning to make sure they don't get too big and blow over. But of course the Conservators are not working alone in the district. London Borough of Redbridge, London Borough of Waltham Forest and Newham, all the local authorities now have to produce what is called a biodiversity action plan, which is taken an opportunity to look at all the green sort of open spaces within an area, to look at the kind of vegetation you will have there, because the kind of vegetation is going to influence what kind of plants, what kind of animals will be associated with those plants. And they're particularly interested in Redbridge in bats. And so they've actually produced sort of maps which sort of show where the areas might be sensitive for bats. But this just sort of shows, the green corridors. That's the sort of green corridor of Epping Forest, sort of stretching up further to the north. That's the sort of complex around Hainault and Fairlop. And then this is the roading here. And these link into green corridors right the way through London. The whole idea is that there should be an opportunity for people to actually get out into the countryside and walk, or cycle, along routes, through very pleasant areas in the main, so that you get an opportunity to re-engage with the natural world. because if we don't, we lose so much. And thanks to Cathy for this lovely picture of people just doing that, you know, enjoying walking down Evelyn Avenue on Bushwood on a lovely misty morning, engaging with the natural world, so they get that feel-good factor, which is really sort of underpinning all that I've been trying to say tonight about, you know, how the vegetation doesn't stay the same, it's changed over time, and all those different influences are still at work, making sure that we've got a very interesting vegetation out there to be studied. Thank you.